is Harold Davis. I'm here to teach you about the art and craft of digital photography.
Good morning. Happy September, and thank you for tuning into our webinar. Welcome to the Harold Davis Studio in Berkeley, California. We are so pleased to share some Hand Hdr thoughts, tips, and post-production steps with you today. Many of you know who Harold is, but if you're tuning in with us for the first time today, here's a little bit about Harold. Harold Davis is the developer of a unique technique for photographing flowers for transparency, and he is the creator of multi-raw processing and Hand Hdr processing. He is a Moab master and a Zeiss ambassador. Harold is an internationally known photographer and a sought-after workshop leader. His website is digitalfieldguide.com. Now I'm going to hand it over to Harold. Good morning, Harold.
Hi, Phyllis. Hi, everyone. Yeah, morning has been moving pretty quickly for me, too. It's so good to have people on this webinar who have, I see, been on many others as well, and with us. And so some of what I say will be review of things that I've said before, but I look forward to doing it anyhow. Perhaps the reason that time has been moving quickly is because in our sheltering in place, school has started again in the Berkeley School District. So we've got 4 kids who are doing distance learning here at home. So every day is interesting, I think. Fair summary, Phyllis? Yeah, I know you're muted, but I know it is interesting. The presentation I'm about to show you is divided into 2 parts. I'm going to first of all do a slideshow kind of thing and talk over it and talk about the general issues, some of which Phyllis touched on, when you should use Hand Hdr processing and when you should use automated HDR, when you should use both, and when you should use other techniques such as multi-raw processing or simply blend images in. I do want to emphasize right off the bat that we're going to touch on photography by way of showing the examples at the end. That are obviously photographs, and I'll show the raw files that I worked from, but primarily the techniques that I show you are in the digital darkroom, what to do with it once you've shot it. However, the implications for how to approach photography are a humongoid, like the waterfall behind me, which by the way is Upper White River Falls, and the original files for this image are one of the examples that I prepped. And one of the hallmarks of a good landscape example that benefits from some portion of Hand Hdr processing is something where the lights and darks are as or otherwise known as dynamic range, are as broad as possible, e.g. in this case, the white water flowing behind me and the colors in the sky up above are just really 2 different kettles of fish. So the idea that you can process them similarly is fallacious, basically. Wrong, doesn't work. So let me, without further ado, go to share my slideshow. Hand Hdr photography. If you're here for small magical pixies and spaceships, which should be a webinar Phyllis and I should do someday, this is not the right place. And we are very excited to learn that my Creative Garden photography book just hit the warehouse. So once they get their act together, the physical book will be shipping probably, I guess, in the next week or so. We beat the publication date with some time to spare. I'm very excited about this book. Wait till you see it. And the subtitle of the book, Making Great Photos of Flowers, Gardens, Landscapes, and the Beautiful World Around Us. That gives me a lot of room, and I take advantage of it in the book. Reviews appreciated, by the way. And at the end of this presentation, I will give you the discount codes at the publisher for both books. And one of the great deals that the publisher has is a bundled price on the ebook and the real book. And I really always prefer the real books, but sometimes it's nice to be able to also put the e-version on your mobile phone or laptop. So one of the guiding principles of this presentation is what I like to call the Arthur Weasley principle. This is named after a character in the Harry Potter books, actually the father of a character. And Ron Weasley is like, and his sister get into trouble with magical objects. And so Arthur Weasley is paternally gives a principle. It's sort of like, you know, watch where you put your feet or something like that. Never trust anything that can think for itself if you can't see where it keeps its brain. What does this have to do with Hand Hdr? Well, what do you know about how automated HDR software works? And I don't really care here whether you're talking about Photoshop, Lightroom, Nik HDR FX Pro, which tends to be my go-to, Aurora, which does a really good job, and there's the sort of grandparent of HDR software, Photomatics. All of these pieces of software, if you ask the companies or read their literature, they say, okay, we take your image into 32 bits and we do magical things with it, and out comes a good result. Never trust anything that can think for itself if you can't see where it keeps its brain. I can't see where the software keeps its brain. Now, often I can get nice results out of it, particularly if it's fairly clear what result I'm trying to get. But it's really hard when the software doesn't read my mind and know what I'm looking. And as Phyllis said in her introduction, some key examples of this are high key and low key images that often benefit from HDR, but when you run them through the automated programs, and time permitting, I'll show you an example of doing this, you come up with really pretty rubbishy results. One of the problems, if you will, that I had in preparing this presentation is that I use Hand Hdr post-production techniques in essentially every multiple shot image that I make. Let's parse that a little bit. So, of course, not every photograph I make is a multi-shot image. And I'll get in a little bit later in this presentation, I'll get into why you can't do multi-shots in some situations. But most of my serious images, or all of my serious images, very serious, where it's possible to use a tripod. And again, it is not always possible to use a tripod for reasons of legality, for reasons of practicality, for reasons of I don't want to carry this thing around all day, for whatever reason. Sometimes I can't or don't use a tripod, but my goal is usually to use a tripod. Certainly in studio photography, like the dried flowers you see on the light box here on this image. So every time I use a tripod and do multi-shot photography, Hand Hdr processing, which means using layers, layer masks, and the tools such as the gradient and the brush tool to pick out areas is a part of my post-production workflow. Sometimes it is all of my post-production workflow. Sometimes it is a relatively small part, 50% of my post-production workflow. Sometimes when I've done a bracketed image like this dahlia on the light box, I find that one of the exposures gets me 80% of the way there. That was the case here. One of the exposures got the petals of this light box nicely. The only problem was that it was that it didn't show the interior of the flower. I needed a lighter exposure to get the interior of the flower. So I very quickly, and if I say so myself, rather deftly, just painted in the interior of the flower from a lighter exposure. At this point, you might ask, the question of, okay, Harold, if you're doing that, why didn't you just use multi-raw processing to lighten the interior of the flower by 1 or 2 EVs? Or why didn't you use the screen blending mode or an adjustment in Lightroom, or one of the many other ways in post-production that you can accomplish the same effect? Well, it's a good question, and I could have, but the thing is that, well, there are 2 things. One is that in Photoshop and other post-production tools, there are always more than one way to do anything. The other thing is that if you raise the exposure of a given image enough to, say, paint in the center of this dahlia when it's dark, say by 2 or 3 EVs, which is what's involved, you are introducing noise into the image. You don't get results that are as good as you get if you simply use another exposure exposed for the proper area of it. So Hand Hdr is in some sense the inheritor of the zone system for digital. It's a way to target every area and every specific area in with the exposure that you need for it. That's the goal and the idea. Let me define the term EV in case there are people on here who don't know that. And then I'm going to stop for a second and ask Phyllis if there are any questions that have accumulated yet. So an EV is an exposure value. It can be obtained through manipulating f-stops of the aperture, or through shutter speeds, or through ISO, or any combination thereof. One EV, it's a logarithmic scale. Each EV is half or twice the one of the previous one. So I'm saying that the center of this flower was about 8 times darker than the petals on the outside. Are there any questions, Phyllis?
Hi. Well, I'm answering a question right now from Mark. He says, I would love Harold to show how he uses the light box. I would pay for that. And I was just typing out, hi, Mark and everyone. Harold did a webinar series on photographing flowers for transparency. This covers lightbox photography. Also, there are other webinars he's done, the 3D photography on a lightbox, and they're all up on Harold's YouTube channel. So you can watch them anytime you want for free.
That's 7 webinars about lightbox photography, and I haven't reached the end of the topic yet. So we may well, you know, what we do typically is we come to the end of the slate of what we have. We see if we're still sheltering in place, and if we are, we put up a new slate of webinars, and we may well do more live lightbox webinars, because I keep on finding things to do on the lightbox. Lately, I've been photographing fruits and vegetables, so I may well do a webinar on that coming up in the next slate after the current one. We've run through the current ones. By the way, that score, I should say that we have some really exciting webinars coming up. On Saturday, we have a free one with Bill Neal, who's a great landscape photographer based near Yosemite, and it's celebrating both of our new books. So this is going to be an interesting and fun and different one. And we have a full slate of other webinars coming up through September, October, and early November. So take a look if you're interested. What else, Phyllis?
Let's see. Danielle says, when you do another Lightbox webinar, I will sign up.
Cool.
Sonia says, will Harold plan to do photo stacking? Was this dahlia photo stacked?
But if by photo stacked you mean it was not focus stacked, which is different. If by photo stacked you mean created using a stack of layers, yes, and I've got a bunch of examples to show of how I do that once I get through the slideshow.
And Danielle also says, even if the pandemic comes to an end, I hope you will continue to do webinars. I love signing up and learning.
Thank you. And
Thank
I also
you.
hope if and when, and I'm a firm believer in when, that I hope we're all here and healthy, and maybe you sign up for a live workshop. Before this happened, we gave photographing flowers on the light box in Berkeley once a year, every June. It was a blast, and people came from all over the world. So in some ways, the best way to learn this is in person, and I enjoy interacting with people in person. I mean, actually, I enjoy these webinars too, and of course, we are interacting. In fairness, I have no idea what I'm going to do when the pandemic comes to an end, but I imagine there'll be a blend of webinars and live workshops and traveling again and seeing people and walking on the Camino again and maybe walking on trails in Japan. Well, don't get me started.
And Charles says also with his system for creating the high key bracket, does he ever do focus stacking with that to get more in focus?
Yeah.
That's an answer, Harold.
You know, I approached that with considerable reluctance, the way a good climber might approach a 5.13 pitch. The problem is that you're multiplying the number of images you need to manage to get a final result. Let's say a good focus stack takes 10 images, okay, to get focus, and let's say a good HDR blend takes 8 exposures. So that's 80 images you have to manage to get into the final stack. Now, there is one piece of software that will, if you photograph things in the right order, will combine both the focus stack and the exposure bracket into one final HDR blended image. This is called PT GUI. It's a piece of software written in Belgium, and it's not free. I don't remember how much it costs, and it won't really do a light box for you. But yeah, I have done that. I would prefer not to, for obvious reasons. Just like I don't want to climb an overhung cliff if I can help it. Or swim with sharks, despite having read an article in today's New York Times about how it's not really dangerous. The thing you should think about, though, I mean, for some reason, focus stacking is an immensely sexy topic. It's got to be number 3 or 4 on the list of the top 10 that I get emails about from readers of my books. And I will note that a couple of my books have an explanation of how to do simple focus stacking, including creative garden photography. There's a nice section, and also my creative close-ups book. But if you don't need it, you don't want it, is the short answer. And often you don't need it. And one place you probably don't need it is on a light box, because light box compositions tend to be fairly flat, so they don't need a lot of depth of field. Okay, unless there's something that seems really pressing, I'm gonna press on. Phyllis, anything there?
Joe wants to know, what was the name again of the software?
PT GUI, PTGUI.
Okay, I'll find it and put a link in the chat box.
Perfect. They're nice people who run it, and it's well-written software, but you do need to comply with their instructions if you're going to use it to combine HDR and focus stacking. I primarily use PT GUI as a panorama creation software, which was its original purpose.
And just one more comment. Terrence says, hope to see another San Francisco black and white workshop.
Terrence, it would be my great pleasure when it's safe to do it. I would love to. Here we have a recent pandemic dahlia, and this is another great example of basically a high-key hand HDR photo. What happens when you blend this together using automated HDR? You get a gray background, because the software doesn't know what you're aiming at. You can take the exposure sliders in the HDR software, shove them all the way to the right to overexpose. It's what I do, but it's still not going to be where you want it. In fairness, I should say that the masking required on a delicate thing like this honeysuckle blossom here is non-trivial. It takes a fair amount of, painting in and masking to get it right. In some cases, it pays to use a masking tool that helps get masking right. Like there's a Topaz has a plugin that helps you create masks so you don't have to do it all by hand. There's another piece of software to look up. And here's another one from recently, a Monarda, where the same thing. The only exposure problem here is the center, which is a heck of a lot darker, very dark brown, almost black, than the nice red petals. That actually can be solved in 2 exposures blended together using hand blending techniques. Glass on a little glass cup on the light box, again merged with a couple of exposures. Okay, and I like these poppies. Again, these are pandemic images, right, Phyllis? Pandemic poppies. The poppies have gone. My dahlia bed is coming to an end, but it's still producing, and so as long as it does, I'm going to be photographing it. Okay, what is dynamic range? This is a question that came up at our breakfast table, I believe. Was it today or yesterday? So it's a dynamic range refers to the range, the distance between light and dark in an image. Some images that are essentially flat, and I have an example of one of these coming up, don't have much dynamic range. An image that has lights or blown out lights and darks has a really broad dynamic range, and then there's the question of the gradations in between. Here's a nice black image. These are also images that automated HDR software does not get right, because it doesn't know that you don't care about the black background. I photographed both these on black velvet, and the automated HDR software tries to get it right. So you see every crinkle and so on in the black velvet, which is not the effect one wants. Yeah, so an image like this also is one that automated software doesn't understand. So you got to take this back to the photography too. So I'm sitting there in the Tiergarten Park in Berlin, okay, and there's the Brandenburg Gate down there. The sunrise is just coming up, a smoggy day, I think in August, and what pieces am I going to want to be able to create an HDR image? Why do photographers always want to extend dynamic range? This is a quest that is as old as photography, as old as the very first images ever made. We have tools that are a great deal more effective at extending dynamic range, almost decade by decade. I mean, film photography with all the tricks and techniques of the wet darkroom was incredibly advanced over the 150 years from the foundations of photography and the chemistry there. And digital has more dynamic range typically than film did, but it's still, we always want to extend dynamic range. Why? Well, part of this has to do with the way human vision and the perception of human vision works. And that is that we can go into a somewhat darkened room. I may look right now like I'm sitting in front of a waterfall as I look to myself, but I'm in a room that has subdued lighting coming in the windows and has in one corner shade, and yet my eye, I can glance around, I can see it all. And furthermore, you go into a room that's got a shaft of sunlight coming in and cobwebs and shadows in one corner, and you can see both, or a lamp on and a dark corner. You can take in both. Most photographs, that's a really extended bit of dynamic range. By some estimates, the human eye and our brains have the capability to recognize about 20 times dynamic range. A photograph is typically going to capture about 8 it with luck. So the point of extending dynamic range is to do something like making up that gap, and that's why photographers have always wanted to. Here's a image, this egg, that photographed on a piece of white paper in a little white plate thing that is pretty much uniform. I mean, there's some grays and lighter lights in it, but they're probably about only 2 EV dynamic range in here. Still an effective image. Not all images need to be high dynamic range images. On the other hand, an image like this in Sundong Cave with the dough line entrance to the cave with bright sunlight coming in and the shadowy part of the cave would never ever work without extending the dynamic range. Similarly here, by eye, in fact, this image extends the dynamic range far beyond what the human eye is capable. By eye standing there, you could either make out what the light coming in the dough line entrance, or you could make out the, you couldn't even really make out the wall of the cave. It was pitch black in there. Behind the cave. And to give a sense of scale of these images, I felt I had to include this one showing our camp there on the right, which you can see that this cave system is large enough to create its own weather system with clouds, with a river down there on the left in the gap, and so on. And again, this is an image with really intense dynamic range, but you can make out the color and the tints at the same time as you can see details, some details outside in daylight. And one other point that I haven't made yet about Hand Hdr processing is that you can avoid an over HDR look. Now, this image here used automated HDR processing along with some hand processing, and I think people looking at it would say that's an HDR image. For the, well, this is of Sapa in Vietnam, and part of the, and it's kind of a very busy image. Most of the time, I prefer to avoid this look really, but so there you go. And here again, another image from Vietnam. This is a Hand Hdr landscape that has some subtlety and flow to it. It doesn't have the brassy look of automated HDR processing. The thing is that both images are blended techniques. Okay, so where do you extend dynamic range if the goal is to extend dynamic range? There are really 3 points, 3 points in the timeline of creating creating a image that extends dynamic range. And so pre-production, what does that mean? Well, some sensors capture more dynamic range than other sensors. I mean, I don't really want to be the person giving you an excuse for getting a new camera, but the truth is that advances in technology have extended the dynamic range that a sensor can capture hugely since I first started, bigly, since I first started photographing in digital in 2004, 2005. My joke on that front is that someday people will buy antique 2005 era digital cameras for the wonderful noise signature of the sensors, just like grain became a thing people sought after in film photography. But anyhow, a sensor done within the last year or two is going to probably have more dynamic range than an older one, and a larger, more expensive camera and larger sensor is likely to have a better dynamic range. Another pre-production technique that can be used to extend dynamic range is actually to work with the lighting where that's a possibility. But, you know, perhaps you're in a situation where you have the lighting you have and you have the camera you have. So dynamic range can be extended during production or photography where it's possible by making multiple shots at multiple different exposures, giving yourself as much possibility. And I like to say about that, film is so expensive. So once you're in a place, you've got yourself somewhere, you've got a composition you've like, you have the camera on a tripod, you might as well take as many exposures as possible. Go for it. What's there to lose? Film's so expensive. Yeah, right. Go until your exposure is totally white, and then go till it's totally dark. You shoot them at 1 EV intervals. There's no reason not to, really, except a little bit of time. Of course, the main where the rubber meets the road and the meat of this webinar and what I have to teach here is about post-production techniques once you've photographed to extend dynamic range. But this part of it, Hand Hdr, is really only going to be relevant if you've taken the time when you are in the photography production phase to make the multiple exposures. I need to stop for a second to get a sip of water here. And while I do, Phyllis, are there any questions?
Yeah, Donald actually has a question. How did you avoid people in the cave shots? Isn't it heavily visited?
Hi, Donald. No, it's not heavily visited. I avoided people in the cave shots mostly because they weren't there. Otherwise, I'd have to paint them out or ghost them. Now, Sun Dong Cave is the world's largest cave in central Vietnam near the Laotian border, and fewer people have been there than have been into outer space. The Vietnamese government licenses one trip with 10 people, 10 customers, 10 paying customers a year, basically. It's not a heavily trafficked place. Anything else?
No, that's it. And I think, didn't you have to walk through the jungle for 2 days to get there or something like that?
Oh, this is all true. And I said one trip with 10 people. That's not quite accurate, but it's only one outfitter who's licensed to do it. Not very many people make it in there. You have to avoid venomous snakes of various sorts, leeches, trekking through the mud, and it's off the old Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is kind of funny. Anyhow, in its own way. Anyhow, no, it's not an easy place to get to, and certainly not easy now, but never was. And no, there were not many people there. But, you know, one interesting point is that if you are in a place with lots and lots of people who are moving and you want to get rid of the people, you can do it by putting your camera on the tripod and doing a really long exposure. Anybody moving vanishes in face of a really long exposure. You may need a neutral density filter to be able to pull that off, though. I've done that in a few places where I really wanted a photograph without people in it, and there were a lot of people milling around things. I've put on a neutral density exposure filter, done a 5-minute exposure, and voila, the people are gone. We're just passing in the night over humanity. Okay, so I included this hotel room photograph as an example of how you can alter the lighting and setup to increase dynamic range, arrange things so that they show more, put the table in the right position to get the reflection from the shade, polish it up so that it reflects more, things like that. And with this camellia, I could prop it and so that it had more dynamic range. So here's a list really of the ways to extend dynamic range. Get a better sensor. Well, most of us at this point have the sensor we're going to have. Control the lighting. Multi-raw processing. Photograph in RAW and take multiple versions of your raw file and combine them. And I suppose I really, in fairness, need to add adjustments in a software like Lightroom to that as well, which really should be on there. I should have a bullet point that says adjustments, exposure adjustments. Automated HDR software, whatever brand, Photoshop, Aurora, and so on. Hand Hdr. And there, I have adjustments. It's just perhaps slightly in the wrong place. Blending modes and various plugins. I mean, some of the Topaz Simplify allows you to adjust exposure. Nix Vivesa is a pretty good exposure alteration tool that allows you to extend dynamic range. And so the next question is, when do you use what? You can mix and match. multi-raw versus Auto Hdr versus Hand Hdr. That's really the trade-off that I face in my practice. And so some of the things we've said already are hints here. If it's going to be a photograph on black, and I do have, by the way, a full webinar on photographing on black coming up. I think it's a week from Saturday, and we plan to do a live photography as part of that, showing me actually doing the photography. If it's going to be on black, or if it's going to be a light box, you can't use Auto Hdr. Okay, so that's a clue. If you can't use a tripod, probably you're not going to want to use any kind of multi-shot technique, and most likely then you're going to have multi-raw processing as your best bet. Okay, so those are important hints. Photograph like this out in I think it's called Tower Arch in the backcountry of Arches Park, where I was in February before this all began. The exposure range was really great between the sunset behind the arch and the dark arch facing me. So this was a situation that called for a blend of automated and Hand Hdr. And same thing here in Death Valley, although this was a blend of 8 exposures, but I could have achieved a lot of it with 1 or maybe 2. And similarly here along the Camino Portuguese in Spain, with a tripod set up and a garden in the foreground and a sky in the background. Mix and match, it's usually what I do. Yeah, well, you know, the lighthouse here is, of course, a very different exposure values than either the sky or the foreground. So painting in the rays of light from the lighthouse is the way to go. And this was 6 exposures of this triple spiral stair. Here, some more examples of mixing and matching different exposures to get pleasing effects. Night photography is pretty rarely going to be achievable nicely with a single exposure. Here on the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, the reflection EVs of the reflection value and the color in the sky are really very different values. And same thing here with this coastal oak tree not far from us. We're going around the world. Inside interior spaces like this Leonardo da Vinci designed dome in Pavia, Italy, has a range from light to dark that is, again, close to impossible to process any other way than using multi-shot techniques. Sunrise at Cour du Ciel in southwestern France, and again, a range in the foreground to the lights in the old city and the clouds beyond. This was an image in the famous historic library in Stokov Monastery above Prague in the Czech Republic, where I had 2 challenges, one of which was to remove the people, and the other was to exposure stack, if you will, using Hand Hdr, because otherwise the bottom of the library was way too dark. And also in Prague, looking down the center tower. Sky and earth are very different exposure values here. A simple gradient tool was the Hand Hdr way to blend here. And with this image in Morocco, I raced up to this point to get the sunset, got my camera and tripod out, and did 8 exposures and was able to blend them pretty quickly. So we see a series of exposures that are blended and combine HDR and automated HDR and probably multi-raw processing. It's going to depend on the specifics of the individual image. And you have to use your judgment about what technique you're going to use in post-processing. Here with the Eiffel Tower and the sky here, the bottom is a very different kind of image than the top. And I'm kind of racing through here because I have these examples and I think you're really going to want to see them. While I do race through these, Phyllis, any more questions?
There's a question that comes up from a few people. What's the difference between Auto Hdr and Hand Hdr?
So Auto Hdr is software that comes bundled in Lightroom, bundled in Photoshop, or standalone, or as plugins from companies including Nik, where it's called HDR FX Pro, Aurora, Photomatix, and there are a few other companies. And what you do with those is you feed the different images in. There's usually some kind of dialogue which says open, and you put in the images and you press a few buttons and it produces an image for you, which you can then tweak a bit afterwards. But this is the Arthur Weasley principle, where it's something that's magical. It creates this magical composite exposure image, but you don't really know how it's doing it. And if there are follow-up questions on that, please let me know, because that's about all I know about it in a way, but I don't want to leave anything a mystery.
So Hand Hdr would be you're doing that blending yourself using layers and masking in Photoshop?
Correct.
Okay.
Well said.
And Charles would like to know what's the difference between multi-raw processing and Hand Hdr processing?
Oh, great question, Charles. Multi-raw processing is taking a single raw image, which as you can look at it this way, that the raw file is the score, and what you create out of it is the performance. And each raw file contains a range of EV, something like 8 to 10 EV in a single raw file. So you can process it more than once and access those different exposure values and combine the different values. And I believe we have a multi-raw processing webinar up on our YouTube channel that you can view. So in some ways, this Hand Hdr webinar is in sequence following on the multi-raw processing. Often multi-raw processing should be the first stop and then Hand Hdr the next stop.
So multi-raw processing is what you do when you have just one shot of something, like say you can't use a tripod and you just have to be able to take that one shot because you know your arm's going to wiggle.
Or people are moving through it, for example, and
right.
you want to capture a certain gesture of the person.
And then HDR means that you have multiple exposures, like you've got your camera on a tripod. So you have multiple exposures of the same image without any wiggling or motion of your camera, so that you have an extended dynamic range between all those different shots. And then you can take what you want from those and blend them into your image. Is that right, Harold?
That is so excellently said. Can I quote you?
Absolutely.
It should be apparent to people listening to this that Phyllis is is part of the magical repository where I keep my brains, and co-author of many of our books in everything but name. Multi-raw works best when you only get one shot for whatever reason. Maybe the reason is the subject is in motion. Maybe the reason is that tripods aren't feasible or not allowed. It could be not feasible because you're in a crowded place. It could be not allowed because the rules where you are don't allow it, which all too often is true. Or you have to buy a permit for a tripod or something, which also happens. And it works best also with newer sensors because, as I said earlier, they have an extended dynamic range. Automatic HDR works best when there's slight subject or camera motion. For example, you have photographed in burst mode, and knowing that what you're going to do with this is put it through an Auto Hdr program, and you need to auto align. But all 3 points in this slide are actually fairly important. Another thing that automatic HDR does well is complex masking. Okay, so if you're in a situation where there's a lot of things like tree branch tracing or a delicate hair or something like that, you really don't want to try to mask it. That's typically a nuisance, and automatic HDR program can do well there. The other point is, if you're looking for anything other than generic middle of the road output, and I'm talking technically here in terms of exposure, you don't want to use Auto Hdr because it doesn't know that you want something high key or low key. And for the most part, there's no way to tell it that you do. Yeah, as soon as I get through the slideshow, I'm going to actually go to some examples. And Hand Hdr is you want precise control of what's what, you want a natural look, and the desired outcome is high key or low key. And Hdr exposures from 3 to 10, depending on the situation, bracket 1 EV. Typically, you keep the ISO constant, and it's usually best to bracket shutter speed unless the subject is in motion. The reason for that is if you bracket aperture, you change the depth of field, so the images actually change and they cannot be blended easily. So how do you approach a Hand Hdr stack? You can start in the middle and add dark and add light, or you can go from darkest to lightest, lightest to darkest. You choose the best option based on your pre-visualization, and always have a plan. And here's some more examples of images created using Hand Hdr. These are all monochromatic HDR. So Phyllis and I did a book on monochromatic HDR photography techniques, particularly suitable to extending dynamic range in black and white photos. And these are some of the images that are using the techniques I explained there. Let's start with Upper White River Falls, which you can see behind me. And here are the raw files that I photographed for this image. This is exposed on a tripod, obviously, at 25 seconds, f36, ISO 31. Here's exposed at 30 seconds, f20, ISO 64. And you can see that this one has a nice sky. This one has a nice waterfall. And this one is at 30 seconds, f14, and ISO 64. This has more foreground. Let's look at those in reduced. What you see here are reduced versions that I prepared for this webinar, because I really didn't think anybody is going to want to watch me working with high resolution originals. I took the raw files and I processed them at default values. So what I'm going to do here is I'm simply going to take two of these files and combine them using a layer mask and a gradient. So first of all, we'll open this one in Photoshop, and we'll use this one for the sky, and I'm going to use the lightest exposure for the foreground. So here we are in Photoshop. Let me get rid of this thing. And I'm going to place the lighter version over the darker version, like this. I'm going to close down my lighter version. Okay, so I'm going to call the lighter version lighter. I'm going to go into the layer menu and I'm going to put a hide all black layer mask on it. And now I am going to take the gradient tool from the tool panel and draw it up like this. Well, that wasn't quite so good. I'm going to do it again to get a little more. My layer mask. Oops, what did I do wrong there? I drew it on the layer, not on the mask. So actually being careful in Photoshop with what little thumbnail you're working on is important.
So Harold, white reveals and black conceals?
White reveals, Phyllis, and black conceals. You might want to point people to a couple of our Photoshop webinars, Photoshop 101, for example.
Right. So you can see on the thumbnail in the layer stack there that there's white predominantly on the bottom and black on the top. You see that? So that's making the layer underneath show the bottom but not show the top. It's hiding the top. Is that right, Harold?
Oh, so well said.
Excellent.
No, next time you're going to be giving the webinar. Is that a promise or a threat? So yeah, I mean, I want to say that what you now have is perhaps, 70% of the way toward the finished image that you see behind me in my virtual screen. What I also probably would want to do is take the brush tool here and let me put the brush tool, it's about a nice size, and let me just paint in a little more of the white up here because I want to be a little more pinpointy about it than I was with the overall sweep of the gradient tool. I'm going to turn down the opacity of the brush a bit and also paint in a bit more here too. And obviously there are other things one can do to increase the saturation in the sky to arrive at the final image you see behind me, but this is 60 or 70% of the way there from those original raw files. So again, let me point out to you what those raw files looked like. They looked not so great. Here's one for the sky. Here's one for the foreground. Are there questions about this example?
I'm just waiting to see if anything pops up in the chat. Charles says, thanks for the mistake. Made me feel better since I often forget where I am in Photoshop.
Yeah, it happens to me all. It's a story of my life. Actually, you learn most from mistakes, so it's great to make mistakes.
I sent back to Charles, we do it all the time and nobody's perfect.
Yeah, nobody's perfect. Okay, so let's have a look at Dragon on Black. Okay, so here are 5 images. These are the raw files. I just show them to prove that I have the raw files. Photographed at 10 seconds, ISO 64. They're all at the same f-stop, probably f22, using my Zeiss 100 millimeter macro. It's got a toy dragon on a dragon fruit that we later first tried to photograph on a light box and then ate when that proved impossible. The background here is black velvet. With black velvet, you go from a neutral histogram to totally almost black. The reason this is a preview of the material from our webinar in a couple of weeks on photographing on black. And okay, so here are the reduced file size at the default value. I'm just gonna quick run these through Hdr, so you see what happens when you put something like this through an automated HDR program, and it's not going to be pretty. And while it's doing that, so here's an automatic HDR program, and one thing you have to look out for is if it can't read the auto spacing, you put the auto spacing in, you create HDR, and here's what the HDR blend looks like, basically. Well, actually, it's not so bad in point of fact. I would have thought it would have done a worse job, but there you go. So actually you could go say, hey, that's not a bad basis for my photograph, but that's not what I do. Okay, I'm not saving that. So basically what you want to do here is you want to start with the darkest one. So this is the exposure that's run at 3/5 of a second. And you want to paint in the stuff you want on the totally black background. So this one is 5-second exposure. And I can put a, where's my,
So Harold, what you're doing there is basically copying that exposure over and making a second layer on top of the original exposure you opened up, right?
exactly right. That's exactly right. And that's what the process of Hand Hdr is. It's creating these kinds of layer stacks. What I'm going to do here is make sure that my brush has some hardness when I paint this in, and get it in to pretty close to full opacity. And this part I think of as like magic when it reveals.
Yeah, so you're painting on the black Hdr layer mask right now, yeah?
Correct. I'm painting in the dragon fruit onto the Hdr layer mask, like that. And then what I can do is I can go and take the next layer, the 10-second layer, bring that into Photoshop, bring it on top of the layer stack, like that. And I can actually copy and paste the previous layer mask up to it too, to get a bit of it and say, hey, I don't want that at full opacity. I want to take it down a little. So there you go. That's not bad. And if I really want to make the dragon, say, lighter, because then I can duplicate this layer. I can take off my layer mask, delete layer mask. I can put this into screen blending mode. I can put it back up to 100% opacity. I can go layer mask, and add another Hdr layer mask. And I can paint in my toy dragon a little bit up here, like that. Okay, any questions about this?
There was a question. It's normal blending mode for all the layers?
Well, except for this last one that I did in screen blending mode. Yeah, I mean, so there's no rule about that. Typically, if I'm going dark to light, as in a photograph on black example, it's going to be normal, except for perhaps screen towards the top of the stack. And typically, if I'm doing on a light box, it's going to be normal, except for perhaps multiply towards the top of the stack. And in both cases, if you essentially both soft light and overlay increase dynamic range. So sometimes I add a layer with a little bit of soft light or overlay, soft light usually, not overlay, at the top of the stack. But you have to be really, really, really careful with that. Again, it can look problematic if you get to more than 10 or 20% opacity. Anything else?
Lorraine's wondering how you copied and pasted the images over on top of each other. She says she thought you'd have to copy paste one on top of the other.
I'm sorry that I did that so quickly, or Lorraine, that's a very valid question. So again, the Photoshop 101, I think we spent a fair amount of time on that. There are several techniques for copying one layer on top of another. Let me just get another layer up here. I'm gonna Okay, so now I have yet another layer here, and one way to go is I can take the source layer, and the one that I want to copy on top is called the source, and I go select all, and then I go edit, copy, and then I make sure the target's selected, and I go edit, paste. You will note that each of those steps has a keyboard shortcut you can use instead, and probably that's what you're going to want to do. The reason I don't use that when I demonstrate is that you can't see me doing a keyboard shortcut on the webinar, but you can see me on your screen when I do a menu item. So that's basically the foolproof way to copy one layer over another. And let me put since I mentioned soft light blending mode, let me put the layer that I put there into soft light. And yes, that increases dynamic range, but it's kind of ugly. So I put the opacity for the whole thing down to about 12%, and it's not bad. The other way, moving that layer off, the other way, the one that I was quickly using, is to you have the source selected, you choose the move tool from the tools panel, you hold down the shift key, and with the mouse you drag it over the target, you let go of the mouse, and you let go of the shift key. The order is important, and it's easy to get that one wrong. So so there you have it. It's the cowboy person's fast way to do it when you're doing a lot of them.
Yeah, and holding down the shift key makes the layers, auto align. If you release the shift key before you release the mouse after you've dragged, it won't align them. It'll sort of pop it off somewhere weird. So the copy and paste method is actually the most secure in the sense of you'll have it exactly aligned.
Correct. Correct, and well said, Phyllis. Okay. More questions? Oh, I've already deleted it. Let's have a look at some apples that I shot. When was that? Only yesterday, Phyllis?
We've been doing a lot of fruit and vegetables lately.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
digging through our pantry.
Yeah. Never be bored. So here are the raw files, and again, this is with the Zeiss 100mm macro, which is a beautiful lens, but it doesn't record itself automatically on my camera. So but these were all at a constant aperture, f14, and this was 1.6 seconds and ISO 64, 0.8 seconds, 0.4 seconds, a fifth of a second, or 0.2 seconds, 0.1 second, and 1/20th of a second, 1/40th of a second. I don't know why they can't record them all decimal or all as fractions. It's weird how EXIF does that, but okay. So this is a classical, and I mean classical, HDR, Hand Hdr exposure paradigm. You've got a still subject. You've got a pretty fair amount of dynamic range in the subject. And I'm varying by 1 EV on shutter speed. There's really no reason why not. There's no reason not to go from pretty bright here, where the only thing that's really exposed in this one is the topmost stem of the apple slice that has a stem, to really dark, where the only thing that might even be properly considered dark is the center of the apple slices, where you're seeing through to the white light box. Okay, what happens? Okay, so here are the default versions of that, quickly processed through Photoshop and reduced so that we don't have to wait forever while we watch this thing. What happens when you run this through automated HDR? Let's find out. So you can see that our anything magical where you don't know where it keeps its brain is doing its thing. I don't know how it got those results, but it's not a bad blend of the exposures in this case. That's not bad. It's a little bit garish perhaps, but it's really not bad. And you could take something like this structurized one, bump the exposure up quite a bit, and it's not bad, although it subdued the colors too much. So, you know, you get to pick from here. I think I like that bright best. That's really not bad. Okay, so here is an automated HDR exposure process of that image set. And going back to our images, in real life and processing this, what I'm going to look for is I'm going to look for probably what I think the best closest exposure on my bracket is. And I think, let's say it's this 1/5 of a second one. This is pretty good. So let's open it up. Let's open it up here. And what I'd like to do on top of that is make the centers of the apples a little darker. So let's do that. Let's open up the 1/10 of a second exposure. Okay. So I'm now going to copy the 1/10 in alignment on top of the 5th, like that. Close the 1/10 so that we have a little sanity on our desktop. And let's mark what's what here. This is 0.2 of a second. This is 0.1 of a second. I'm just going to minimize the automatic HDR for a moment. Why am I not in alignment here? Good question. Let's see. Did I do the trick? Nope. Okay. So you saw me make a mistake again. Isn't that cool? It happens. So the good thing about Photoshop is Photoshop usually means never having to say you're sorry. You go back and do it again. So we're going to open up the 1/10 of a second again. The move tool, hold down the shift key, move it on top, let go of the mouse, and there you are. Close this down, and this is 0.1. This is 0.2, and I am going to put a layer on the darker one, layer mask, hide all, and now I'm going to take my brush, I'm going to put it at about 50% opacity, and I'm going to make the centers of the apple slices darker. I'm going to make my brush nice and soft so no hard edges show. That's too big. So maybe at about 700 pixels, like that. Okay, so I'm painting in some more detail. I'm not sure how well this comes across on the Zoom screen rendition, but there you go. Okay, so I'm just painting in a little bit of detail into the center of the apple. Here is what that layer mask looks like. You can see the shapes of the apples reflected in the mask. Now going back to the automated HDR, you know, I like it. I like the brassiness of the color here, but I don't like it quite so much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy it. I'm going to copy it over my original image and like that, and put its opacity down to about 40%. So we have both some of the automatic HDR and some of the hand HDR in this image. There you go. That's about right. for proceeding onward with the image. I want to point out that normally speaking, there's a color space rule, and this has come up in a couple of previous webinars, that you want to stay in as wide a gamut color space as long as possible. And you also want to stay as high bit as long as possible. With these examples, I knocked down the bits, the bit depth, so that the files would be not so time consuming to work with. But so I got an error message when I was doing the conversion because the Auto Hdr file was higher bit depth, and I needed to convert down and also to convert the color space. In a normal workflow, you wouldn't see that kind of thing because you would be working in as wide a gamut space as possible. Are there questions about this example?
Let's see, Lorraine's, we've been going back and forth in the chat. She's been wondering about why is it called HDR, and I've been explaining that you're expanding the dynamic range from lights to darks by blending the bracketed images in a layer stack in Photoshop.
Right, and that would be the case whether you use Hand Hdr in Photoshop with layers and masking, or whether it's a piece of software that calls itself an HDR software. It's not a term I invented, HDR. Let's put it that way. It's been around since, sometimes it's called extended dynamic range or extending dynamic range rather than HDR. But it's sort of, when they started coming out with the software, probably in the early 2000s, it was kind of a sales gimmick. In other words, instead of normal photography, which has a given dynamic range, this has a higher dynamic range, hence HDR. And anything else?
No,
I
think
who is the artist who slices these apples so thin? That would be Phyllis.
I sent back to her, c'est moi, and I have a Band-Aid on my finger too.
Yeah, well, Phyllis, can we do more slicing today? Well, my finger hasn't recovered quite yet. She's
almost
a hero.
there. Give me another week.
She's a hero. Okay, next. These are kind of fun examples, though. I mean, it's always a challenge for me to create examples that are realistic but doable in the context of okay, I'm going to do them fast in front of a crowd of people. And here you have Lady Boot Arch, named because people thought the silhouette was like a boot. And if this is in the Alabama Hills region between Lone Pine, California, and Mount Whitney, California, we have 3 exposures. They're all at ISO 3200 and f3.5, 28 millimeter focal length. And they range from 30 seconds to 120 seconds or 2 minutes. Okay. And looking at these exposures, I really wanted to get the airplane trail, which I think is what that is, unfortunately, not a comet, in the sky, which you can see on the upper left. It may be too dark to come across on the Zoom screen, so let's open it up a bit. And we can lighten up that top part of the sky a bit. I'll put on a duplicate layer and I'll put it into screen blending mode. It makes it a little clearer. Layer mask, hide all, and like that. So you can see that a bit. And then on the foreground, I want to use this one, which has got a little bit of light painting for the arch. But on the other hand, at 2 minutes, what do you think happens to stars? They move. So stars in motion. So if you tried to put this through an automated program, basically you'd get mush, because it wouldn't quite know what to do with this. And also, I don't really want the moving stars. I want the trail up in the sky. So I just put it on top like that, and then I can put a hide all layer mask on, layer mask, hide all, and I'm going to put a gradient here. So basically, like that, and there you go. You get the idea. Are there questions about this one?
I don't see any questions yet. Would you make the top layers invisible and sort of work up through the stack so we can see the differences?
Okay, so I first put on a screen blending mode of the background layer with itself to make the Milky Way and the shooting trail a little brighter and more showy. And then I put on the bottom layer to make Lady Boot Arch and the light painting and the silhouette there more obvious. And I also could, if I want, duplicate that layer and put the duplicate into screen blending mode to make it even lighter, like that. I mean, for a print, I would not do that because this is over exaggerated, but it's, it's difficult to see things sometimes via Zoom screen sharing. And so the layer mask that I used, here, let me turn this one off. The layer mask that I used for the top layer, this is the important one, looks about like that. So black conceals, white reveals. The sky is not in this one. The sky with the moving stars is not in this one, only at the bottom of the arch.
So Sonia has the question, does using a gradient make the effect more subtle, Harold?
Absolutely. A gradient is intended to seamlessly blend two layers. And also, since in the top, we're not getting the stars in motion, we're only getting the one where the stars were still at 30 seconds. 30 seconds in night photography is about the borderline between motion of the stars. It's, of course, not motion of the stars, it's the motion of the Earth. But at about 30 seconds, you don't really see significant rotation from the Earth in the star movement, but much beyond that, you begin to see it. It's a little more complicated than I put it because it also depends on the focal length of the lens you use. The longer the focal length, the more motion you see.
Danielle asks, why did you paint in white on the black mask to hide the plane trail? I think that there was one mask that was dealing with the plane trail.
Let me just merge these two down so we don't have that as an issue, and then let me just get rid of this one. So that, and I'll just delete this layer, and so I've just simplified things a little bit. So all we have is one layer mask, and the upper layer is for the sky, and it shows the stars not moving and the plane trail. The lower layer is for the arch, and it shows the little bit of light painting on the arch and the silhouette of the arch. So let me show this layer mask again. So this white part is showing the lower layer. The black part is the white part is showing the upper layer where it's got the arch. The black part is showing the lower layer where the stars aren't showing motion blur. And if there are questions, I would be very happy to try to answer them to the best of my ability.
Terrence has the question, what's the difference between the Monochromatic Hdr photography book and your new black and white book?
My newish black and white book, with now more than a year old, it focuses on, so to speak, on a wide range of black and white techniques, and in particular, how one of the big sections of the book are creative possibilities with black and white after you've already done the basic black and white processing, the Ansel Adams effect, how you make images look solarized, the Karl Blossfeld effect, sepia tinting images, a whole range of things like that. The Monochromatic Hdr book focuses and is exclusively on techniques for creating extended range dynamic photography that is intended to be presented as a monochromatic image. So it's a more special purpose book. I think it's also, it may be out of print, I'm not sure.
I don't think so. I saw it available on Amazon.
Also, it's not out of print then, it's a focal press book.
Deborah asks, you bracketed with shutter speed. When do you bracket with aperture?
You have to be careful about bracketing with aperture. The default the go-to should be shutter speed. You can bracket with aperture where changing the aperture will not change the depth of field in the composition. I believe there was one of the images that I showed had aperture bracket, the White River Falls one as well. But you have to be careful about that. I mean, shutter speed, if the subject isn't in motion, is a no-brainer. Aperture, yeah, it can change the composition depending on depth of field. So you have to take care to watch your checklist of items before you bracket by aperture.
And Danielle asks, so when photographing on Lightbox HDR images, you start with the lightest exposure on the bottom and add darker images on top using normal blending mode with the possible use of a multiply mode on the topmost images.
Yes. And I highly recommend starting with our Lightbox #1 YouTube video and going through to number 5 and then doing the Lightbox in 3 dimensions. So that's 7+ hours of video watching, and you'll either be tired of me or ready for the pandemic to end by the time you're through all that. But nonetheless, and so I would add, besides the multiply blending mode at the top, that would be done very lightly. And you might also want to add a little, what I call reserved Auto Hdr blend in at the top as well.
And Danielle then asks, when starting with black velvet at the base, do you do the opposite?
Absolutely. A good question, and yes.
And Mark asks, I understand the technique and masking for exposure, but what about using the adjustment brush and paint to remove shadows, darken with black, or lighten with white? Is it a noise issue?
That's a great question, Mark. It's not an either or, it's both. And yes, it's a noise issue in the sense that if you're using separate exposures, noise is not an issue the way it can be if you use an adjustment. One of the easiest ways to produce annoying and offensive noise is to try to raise up an underexposed image too much. So there's really only so far you can go with tools like adjustment brushes. Roughly speaking, about 1 EV would be how far you can go. So if you can keep it within that, it's fine to use those tools in a single exposure. Remember, I showed a slide of all these different techniques along with the words mix and match. So it's not either or, it's use both of them. The examples I've shown of the sort of the bare bones of the technique, but in real life, I would use as, I want to use every advantage that the photographic deity has given me as best I can.
And Mike has a question. What do you think of making your mask with selections based on luminance, as in luminosity masking?
I think that's where it works. It's a very, very effective technique and can save time over trying to do it by hand. And even if you aren't using luminance masking, there are other automated masking techniques that in the right situations can save you a lot of time and and be functionally a good, very good head start on getting most of masking done. I always liked, some situations like the upper White River Falls image behind me, where basically you just want a gradient mask, are pretty simple. But in anything more complex than that, I always like to look at it and say, okay, here I have a masking challenge. What are the Photoshop tools that the Photoshop deity has given to me? And how can I do this with the least effort and the best results? And luminous masking in some cases is a good choice there.
And Joe says she plans to go back to all of your lessons. Where should she go first?
Hi, Joe. Well, that depends what interests you most first. I don't know how many webinars do we have up on YouTube? I don't know, 20 or 30 at least.
A lot.
A lot. I would say, why don't you start with Creative Garden Photography, the book, because it's got a summary of a lot of these techniques, including probably the best in-print lightbox summary that I have, taking the camera in along with the techniques. Then see what really interests you, and then go further. There are different learning styles in life. I will confess that despite doing all these webinars and putting them up on YouTube, I'm not really a learner from videos. The way I learn is I have a challenge and I try to do something. That's what works for me, and that's what I really like to see in students. But I have to acknowledge, in fairness, that that there are different ways to learn, and more power to whoever is learning differently. And so, it's hard to say what interests you. If you want to go to Photoshop, why don't you go to, if that's what really interests you, go to the Photoshop specific webinars. Also, we do have a fairly nice menu of upcoming webinars, some of them with some other great photographers, not just me. And I'd encourage anyone to ask as many questions as they want on any of these. That's part of the benefit of live webinars, is there's no reason anyone should leave one of these sessions without complete clarity about something. So, by all means, ask me questions, ask Bill questions when he comes on Saturday. And ask Jennifer King when she comes on in a couple of weeks, and ask Alan Shapiro, who does great food photography, about his ideas. So webinars are great.
And Jane says the Creative Garden book is really wonderful. Does have a lot in it. I got it online and am eagerly awaiting the hardbound book. Worth getting.
Thank you. Put that in a review, please, for us. Greatly appreciated.
And Sonia asks, which book will have the full details and instructions for this webinar, Harold?
Well, no book. That's why you do the webinar. But the material in Creative Garden Photography is a good starting place.
Right. I think that
one of the things I tried to make it a really comprehensive book. It is 360 pages, I'll have you know, and the content is both technical and thoughtful about why we do garden photography, where to go, and all that kind of thing. But I included a lot of technical content, leaving aside advertising for my books, which I'm supposed to do more of. That's what my kids tell me. But leaving that aside, what I was about to say was that the point, to some extent, of doing a webinar for me, I do some of them that are just like, okay, here's fun. I did one on what have my trips walking the Camino been like, and that was just a fun webinar. And I think the one with Bill on Saturday is going to be something of that sort. It's really about the role that nature has played in our photographic and personal lives, and that's just a fun thing to do. I'll probably do one about Vietnam too. That's just a fun one. But the ones that are technical are a chance to deep dive into a given subject and go into in more depth and more interaction than you can possibly do in a book context.
I think that's it, Harold.
Thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate it, and I hope you are using this time as a time to make your own personal artist in residency. That's what I've been doing, with a lot of help from Phyllis, vegetable slicing, the kids, and being creative. Thank you very much, everybody.
I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. Be creative and stay mighty.